Thousands of years ago, a human being lay helpless on the ground, suffering from a disease nobody understood. There were no hospitals, no doctors, no laboratories, and no science. There was only pain, a fever that would not break, a wound that would not heal, a mystery that seemed impossible to solve. Yet somehow, long before medicine existed, someone discovered a cure, not in a laboratory, but in the wild. Not through science, but through observation, desperation, and perhaps even pure chance. That single discovery would begin a journey that would eventually save billions of lives. But what was the first medicine? Who discovered it? And how did humanity learn to heal itself before it even understood what disease was? Imagine a world without doctors, a world without hospitals, pharmacies, antibiotics, or painkillers. A world where a simple toothache could become a death sentence, and a small cut could end a life. Tens of thousands of years ago, our ancestors faced that reality every single day. Yet somehow, against all odds, humanity discovered medicine. But how? Who was the first person to look at a plant, a root, or a piece of bark, and believe it could heal instead of harm? And what was the very first disease ever treated by human hands? To answer that question, we must travel back tens of thousands of years to a world that looked nothing like our own. A world where every injury could be fatal and every infection could become a death sentence. Survival was never guaranteed, and nature was both humanity's greatest provider and its greatest threat. Imagine watching a loved one suffer from unbearable pain while having absolutely no idea what caused it. No knowledge of bacteria, no understanding of viruses, no concept of chemistry. For most of human history, disease was believed to be the work of angry gods, evil spirits, or supernatural forces. Yet despite these misunderstandings, people continued searching for answers. Some clues may have come from the natural world itself. Early humans likely observed animals chewing specific plants when they were sick. Others may have discovered healing substances through dangerous trial and error, risking their lives with every experiment. Many failed, some died, but occasionally a remedy worked. And when it did, that knowledge became priceless. What followed was one of the most important discoveries in human history. From ancient healers and forgotten civilizations to the birth of modern medicine, the search for cures transformed humanity forever. This is the story of how the first medicine was discovered, how it changed the course of civilization, and why its legacy still lives inside many of the medicines we use today. The story of medicine is not the story of laboratories or scientific breakthroughs. It begins much earlier, in a time when humans knew nothing about bacteria, viruses, or the inner workings of the human body. Disease was a mystery. Pain was a mystery. Death was a mystery. When people became sick, they often believed they were being punished by spirits, cursed by unseen forces, or abandoned by the gods. Yet even in that darkness, curiosity refused to die. Somewhere in prehistory, a wounded hunter may have chewed the bark of a tree and noticed that his fever eased. A mother desperate to save her child may have tried dozens of plants before finding one that reduced pain. These moments were never recorded, but they may have changed the course of human history forever. Long before medicine became science, it was a dangerous experiment driven by desperation, observation, and hope. What makes this story even more remarkable is that many of those ancient discoveries were surprisingly effective. Thousands of years before the invention of modern aspirin, people used willow bark to reduce fever and pain. Long before antibiotics, ancient civilizations applied honey to wounds, unknowingly taking advantage of its natural antibacterial properties. In some cases, the medicines of the distant past would later become the foundations of modern healthcare. But the deeper we investigate, the more fascinating the mystery becomes. Was the first medicine discovered by accident? Did humans learn from watching animals heal themselves in nature? Or was the birth of medicine simply the result of countless generations refusing to accept suffering as inevitable? To answer those questions, we must travel back to the very beginning, to a world where every cure was a miracle, every remedy was a risk, and every discovery carried the power to change humanity forever. 50,000 years ago, long before the first city was built, before the first book was written, and before a single scientific idea had been recorded, survival was humanity's greatest achievement. Every sunrise was uncertain. Every hunt was dangerous. Every injury carried consequences that no one fully understood. Deep within an ancient forest, a hunter moves through the shadows, tracking prey that could mean the difference between life and death for his family. Then, in a single moment, everything changes. One misstep, one fall, a sickening crack echoes through the wilderness. His leg is broken. At first, the injury is painful but survivable. His tribe carries him back to shelter. They clean the wound as best they can. They wait. They hope. But over the following days, something strange begins to happen. The skin around the injury becomes red and swollen. Heat radiates from the wound. His body trembles uncontrollably. A fever rises. The hunter grows weaker with each passing day. Nobody understands what is happening. Nobody knows that invisible microorganisms have entered his body. Nobody has ever heard the words bacteria, infection, or immune system. To them, the suffering appears mysterious, almost supernatural. An unseen enemy has arrived, and no one knows how to fight it. For most of human history, disease was not viewed as a biological problem. It was a terrifying mystery. People could watch a healthy person become weak overnight. They could see a child develop a fever and die within days. They could witness entire groups fall victim to sickness without warning. Imagine living in a world where death could emerge from a scratch, a cough, or a drink of contaminated water, yet no one understood why. The greatest threat to humanity was often not predators, starvation, or war. It was disease. An invisible force that struck without explanation and showed no mercy. And yet, despite living in complete ignorance of biology, our ancestors began searching for answers. They observed nature. They experimented. They remembered. Somewhere, sometime, a remarkable pattern began to emerge. Certain plants seemed to ease pain. Certain leaves appeared to calm fevers. Certain roots seemed to help the sick survive when others did not. Nobody knew why these remedies worked. There were no clinical trials, no laboratories, no doctors. Only observation, instinct, and desperate hope. Humanity's first medical knowledge was not born from science. It was born from suffering. This raises one of the most extraordinary questions in human history. If nobody understood disease, if nobody knew what caused infection, pain, or fever, then how did medicine ever begin? How did the first human discover that a plant could heal instead of poison? Was it pure accident? Was it careful observation? Or was it the result of countless forgotten experiments carried out by people whose names have been lost forever? The answer may lie in one simple moment, a moment so ordinary that nobody could have realized its importance. One day, somewhere in the distant past, a human being chewed a plant, and history may have changed forever. Long before medicine existed, humanity still faced the same enemies we face today: infection, fever, pain, injury, death. Difference was that our ancestors had no framework to explain them. To a modern mind, illness is often understood through biology. We know about viruses, bacteria, inflammation, and genetics. But for tens of thousands of years, disease belonged to an entirely different world, a world of spirits, omens, supernatural forces, and unseen powers. When someone became sick, the question was not, what caused this disease? The question was, who caused it? Imagine standing beside a campfire 10,000 years ago. A healthy member of the tribe suddenly develops a high fever. Within days, they begin hallucinating. Their body weakens. Their breathing changes. Nobody can see the microscopic organisms attacking them from within. To the people around them, something far more frightening seems to be happening. Perhaps an evil spirit has entered the body. Perhaps an angry ancestor is demanding punishment. Perhaps the gods are expressing their wrath. Across continents and civilizations, countless cultures arrived at remarkably similar conclusions. Disease was often interpreted not as a physical problem, but as a spiritual invasion. This belief shaped humanity's earliest attempts at healing. Instead of prescribing medicine, healers performed rituals. Instead of searching for biological causes, they searched for curses. Songs were sung to drive away spirits. Sacred smoke filled shelters and temples. Prayers echoed through caves, villages, and early cities. What is fascinating is that these practices were not signs of ignorance alone. They represented humanity's first effort to understand suffering. People desperately wanted answers, and when science did not yet exist, mythology filled the void. The human need to explain pain was already there. The tools simply had not been invented yet. But among the strangest practices ever discovered by archaeologists is one that still shocks scientists today. Thousands of years before modern surgery, ancient humans were drilling holes into living skulls. The procedure is known as trepanation. Evidence of trepanation has been found on nearly every inhabited continent, with some examples dating back more than 7,000 years. At first glance, it seems impossible to understand. Why would anyone deliberately cut through a human skull using primitive stone tools? The answer becomes even more astonishing when researchers examine the bones more closely. Many of these skulls show clear signs of healing. The patients survived. In some cases, they survived for years after the procedure. This discovery creates an extraordinary mystery. Were ancient people attempting to release evil spirits believed to be trapped inside the head? Were they treating headaches, seizures, mental illness, or traumatic injuries from hunting and warfare? The truth is that nobody knows for certain. Yet what makes trepanation so important is not whether it worked. It is what it reveals about the human mind. Faced with pain they could not explain, our ancestors refused to do nothing. They experimented. They took risks. They searched relentlessly for solutions. And although many of their beliefs were wrong, their determination would eventually lead humanity towards something revolutionary. Not magic, not ritual, but medicine. The question is, what discovery finally began that transformation? If medicine was not born in a laboratory, then where did it begin? This question has puzzled historians, anthropologists, and scientists for generations. The truth is that the first medicine was almost certainly never invented in the way we imagine today. There was no single genius, no breakthrough experiment, no written discovery. Instead, the birth of medicine may have emerged from countless accidents scattered across thousands of years. Small observations, unexpected outcomes, tiny moments that seemed insignificant at the time, but would eventually alter the course of human history. Somewhere in the distant past, a suffering human being encountered a natural remedy by chance, and for the first time, pain eased. To understand how this might have happened, we must first look away from humans and toward the natural world. Long before humans practiced medicine, nature had already been conducting its own experiments for millions of years. Modern scientists have discovered something extraordinary. Many animals appear to treat themselves when they are sick. Certain species of chimpanzees have been observed swallowing rough leaves whole without chewing them. Others seek out bitter plants that offer no nutritional value. Researchers later discovered that some of these plants contain compounds capable of reducing parasites inside the body. In other words, the chimpanzees were not eating for food. They were eating for medicine. Without understanding biology, they had somehow learned which plants could help them survive. And chimpanzees are not alone. Elephants have been observed seeking specific vegetation before giving birth. Some pregnant females appear to consume plants that can stimulate labor. Deer have been seen altering their feeding behavior when injured or ill. Across the animal kingdom, scientists continue to uncover evidence of what is now called self-medication. The implications are astonishing. If animals can learn to identify healing plants through observation and experience, then perhaps early humans did the same. Imagine ancient hunters watching a wounded animal repeatedly return to the same plant before recovering. Imagine generations of people noticing patterns that others ignored. In a world without books, nature itself may have been humanity's first medical teacher. But observation alone was not enough. Every discovery came with a terrible price. Somewhere in prehistory, a mother watches her child grow weaker with every passing hour. The fever rises. The child refuses food. Breathing becomes difficult. There are no healers with proven remedies. No written knowledge to guide decisions. Only fear. Only uncertainty. Desperate to save the life before her, the mother begins trying whatever nature offers. One plant changes nothing. Another makes the child worse. Another may even be poisonous. Every choice carries risk. Every failure teaches a painful lesson. And throughout countless generations, many paid for those lessons with their lives. Yet this is where one of the greatest stories of human survival begins. Because eventually, somewhere, one of those choices worked. Perhaps a leaf reduced inflammation. Perhaps a root eased pain. Perhaps a bark lowered a dangerous fever. The effect may have been small, but it was impossible to ignore. The child improved. The suffering lessened. Hope appeared where there had only been fear. That moment would be remembered, shared around campfires, passed from parents to children, preserved long before writing existed. What started as blind experimentation slowly became knowledge. This may have been the true birth of medicine, not a dramatic discovery announced to the world, but a fragile chain of observations carried through generations. Trial and error, success and failure, life and death. Every remedy that survived did so because someone remembered it. Someone taught it. Someone trusted it enough to try again. But among the thousands of plants growing across ancient landscapes, which ones truly worked? Which remedies were merely superstition, and which contained real healing power? As humanity's experience grew, certain plants began to stand apart from all the others. And one of them would eventually lead to a medicine still used by millions of people today. For thousands of years, medical knowledge survived only through memory. A healer taught an apprentice. A parent taught a child. A tribe passed its remedies from one generation to the next. But memory has a weakness. People die. Knowledge disappears. Entire lifetimes of experience can vanish in a single generation. Then, for the first time in history, something extraordinary happened. Humanity learned how to write. And with that invention, medicine took its first step toward becoming something larger than tradition. For the first time, remedies could outlive the people who discovered them. Our journey now leads to Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, often called the cradle of civilization. Around 2100 BC, scribes began recording medical knowledge onto clay tablets. These tablets, some of which are preserved today in collections, such as those studied and displayed by the British Museum, contain some of the earliest known written medical recipes in human history. Reading them feels like opening a message sent across 4,000 years. They describe mixtures of plants, minerals, oils, and other natural substances intended to treat a variety of conditions. For the first time, healing knowledge was no longer dependent solely on memory. It had become information that could be stored, copied, and shared. Yet these early physicians still lived in a world where medicine and spirituality were deeply intertwined. A treatment might include both a herbal remedy and a ritual prayer. Disease was often viewed as a combination of physical suffering and supernatural influence. To modern eyes, this may seem contradictory, but something important was happening beneath the surface. Humanity was slowly beginning to organize medical knowledge. Patterns were being recognized. Successful remedies were being remembered. Failed treatments were being replaced. Medicine was evolving from scattered observations into a growing body of accumulated experience. Then, nearly 500 years later, another remarkable document appeared along the banks of the Nile. Today, it is known as the Ebers Papyrus, one of the most famous medical texts from ancient Egypt. Dating to around 1550 BC, it contains more than 700 remedies, treatments, and medical observations. The scale of the document is astonishing. Ancient Egyptian healers recorded treatments for digestive disorders, skin diseases, infections, parasites, eye conditions, pain, and many other ailments. As we read these ancient prescriptions today, we are looking directly into the minds of some of the earliest medical practitioners in recorded history. Among the ingredients listed in these ancient treatments, one appears again and again: honey. To the Egyptians, honey was far more than a sweet food. It was applied to wounds, burns, and infections. At the time, nobody understood why it seemed effective. There were no microscopes, no knowledge of bacteria, no understanding of antiseptics. Yet modern science has revealed something remarkable. Honey possesses natural antibacterial properties that can help inhibit the growth of certain harmful microorganisms. Thousands of years before the discovery of germs, ancient healers had identified a treatment that genuinely worked. They did not know the mechanism, but through observation, they found the result. And this raises a fascinating question. If ancient civilizations were recording hundreds of remedies and experimenting with countless treatments, what exactly were they trying to cure? What illnesses haunted the ancient world so frequently that entire medical systems emerged to fight them? Were people struggling with the same diseases we know today? Or were they facing threats that have largely disappeared from modern life? The answers reveal a world filled with parasites, infections, chronic pain, injuries, epidemics, and dangers that surrounded people from birth to death. To understand the true origins of medicine, we must now examine the diseases that forced humanity to become healers in the first place. Throughout history, thousands of remedies have been proposed, tested, celebrated, and forgotten. Some were useless. Some were dangerous. Others may have caused more harm than the illnesses they were meant to cure. But among the countless plants, roots, leaves, and potions used by ancient civilizations, a few genuinely possessed healing power. This is the story of one of them. A story that begins thousands of years ago beside rivers, wetlands, and forests. A story that would eventually connect ancient healers to modern pharmacies. And unlike many lost remedies of the past, this one truly worked. Imagine an ancient community living near a riverbank. Among the trees growing along the water's edge stands a willow tree. For generations, people have noticed something unusual. When they chew its bitter bark or prepare it as a drink, fevers seem to ease. Pain becomes more manageable. Recovery sometimes comes faster. Nobody understands why. There is no chemistry, no biology, no concept of active ingredients, yet the pattern is impossible to ignore. Again and again, the same tree appears to help the sick. Across centuries, this knowledge spreads from village to village, from healer to healer, from one generation to the next. What makes this story remarkable is its longevity. Empires rise and fall, languages disappear, kingdoms collapse. Yet the reputation of willow bark survives. Ancient Egyptians used it. Greek physicians wrote about it. Roman healers prescribed it. Even as civilizations changed, the remedy endured. Few medical treatments in history have remained in continuous use for such an extraordinary length of time. Somehow, ancient observers had identified a natural substance that consistently produced real effects inside the human body. They did not know it, but they were slowly approaching one of the most important discoveries in the history of medicine. Then, centuries later, science finally began to uncover the secret hidden within the bark. Researchers isolated a compound known as salicin. Further investigation revealed how this substance could be transformed into salicylic acid, a chemical capable of reducing pain and fever. For the first time, humanity could see what ancient healers had only observed. The mystery was becoming measurable. The ancient remedy was no longer just folklore. It was chemistry, evidence, science. What generations had discovered through trial and error was now being explained in laboratories. But the story was not finished. In the late 19th century, a young chemist named Felix Hoffmann began working to improve these compounds. Salicylic acid was effective, but it often caused stomach irritation and unpleasant side effects. Hoffmann searched for a safer alternative. His work eventually led to the development of acetylsalicylic acid, a refined compound that would become known around the world as aspirin. What began as bark stripped from a riverside tree was transformed into one of the most widely used medicines in human history. Millions of people would eventually rely on it for pain relief, fever reduction, and later, even cardiovascular protection. And here lies one of the most astonishing connections in all of medical history. Modern aspirin, manufactured in advanced facilities using sophisticated scientific methods, can trace its origins directly back to observations made thousands of years ago by people who knew nothing about molecules, chemistry, or microorganisms. A folk remedy that existed nearly 4,000 years ago became the foundation for a medicine still used today. The distance between an ancient healer and a modern pharmacist may seem enormous, yet both are connected by the same discovery. This realization changes the way we think about the origins of medicine. The first effective treatments were not always born from scientific understanding. Sometimes they emerged from careful observation, accumulated experience, and generations of shared knowledge. Ancient people did not know why willow bark worked, but they recognized that it did, and that recognition became one of the first bridges between superstition and science. Yet willow bark was only the beginning, because while pain and fever could sometimes be eased, another enemy continued to kill millions throughout history. An enemy far more deadly than discomfort. An enemy called infection. For most of human history, the greatest threat to life was not war, famine, or wild animals. It was infection. A small cut from a stone tool, a scrape received during a hunt, a wound suffered on a battlefield. Any one of these seemingly minor injuries could become a death sentence. Today, it is easy to forget how dangerous the world once was. Modern medicine has dramatically reduced the risks associated with infection. But for thousands of years, humanity lived under the constant shadow of invisible enemies. Long before people understood what bacteria were, those microscopic organisms were shaping the fate of entire civilizations. Imagine a young hunter returning to his village after a successful hunt. The wound on his arm appears insignificant. At first, nobody worries. But days later, the skin becomes swollen and painful. Pus begins to form. Fever follows. Soon the infection spreads beyond the wound itself. Family members gather around, helplessly watching his condition worsen. This scene repeated itself countless times throughout history. Mothers, fathers, children, warriors, kings, and laborers all faced the same terrifying reality. Survival did not depend solely on avoiding injury. It depended on surviving what came afterward. Faced with this relentless enemy, ancient civilizations searched desperately for solutions. Across different cultures and continents, people experimented with whatever nature provided. Honey was applied to wounds. Herbal mixtures were crushed into pastes and spread over damaged skin. Wine was poured onto injuries. Vinegar was used to clean infected areas. Sometimes these treatments failed. Sometimes they caused harm. But occasionally, without understanding the science behind them, ancient healers stumbled upon methods that genuinely reduced the chances of death. Through observation and experience, they slowly identified substances that seemed to help wounds heal more successfully than others. Among the strangest discoveries in the history of medicine is one that sounds almost unbelievable today. In several ancient cultures, healers sometimes placed moldy bread directly onto infected wounds. To modern ears, this sounds dangerous, even absurd. Why would anyone intentionally place mold onto an injury? Yet historical evidence suggests that this practice appeared in different forms across various societies. What makes the story remarkable is that some patients actually improved. The wounds sometimes healed. The infections sometimes slowed. The treatment occasionally worked, but nobody knew why. The explanation remained hidden for centuries. This is one of the most fascinating patterns in medical history. Again and again, ancient people discovered effective treatments long before they understood the reasons behind them. They observed results, not mechanisms. They recognized success, even when they could not explain it. The moldy bread was not magic. The honey was not magic. The vinegar was not magic. Unknown to the people using them, they were occasionally exploiting real biological processes. Humanity was collecting pieces of a puzzle without realizing what picture they formed. And then comes the most extraordinary part of the story. For thousands of years, people fought infection blindly. They developed remedies through trial and error. They saved lives without understanding exactly how. Yet the true explanation remained hidden, waiting for someone to uncover it. Somewhere in the future, centuries after these ancient healers had vanished from history, a single observation inside a laboratory would finally reveal the secret. A man would notice something growing where it should not have been growing. And in that unexpected moment, the mystery of mold, infection, and healing would begin to make sense. The war against infection was about to enter a completely new era. By the early 20th century, medicine had advanced further than at any other point in human history. Scientists understood germs. Hospitals were becoming more sophisticated. Surgeons had better tools and a deeper understanding of the human body. Yet despite all this progress, one terrifying problem remained. Infection was still one of humanity's deadliest enemies. A simple cut could become fatal. Pneumonia could kill healthy adults. Even routine surgeries carried enormous risks because doctors often had no reliable way to stop bacterial infections once they began. The world was waiting for a breakthrough, although nobody knew exactly where it would come from. In 1928, inside a laboratory in London, a Scottish bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming was conducting research on dangerous bacteria. Fleming was brilliant, but he was not known for keeping a perfectly organized workspace. Petri dishes containing bacterial cultures often covered his laboratory benches. Before leaving for a vacation, he left several experiments unfinished. It seemed like an ordinary decision. Thousands of scientists had done the same thing before. Nothing about that moment suggested it would become one of the most important events in medical history. When Fleming returned from his holiday, he began sorting through the dishes he had left behind. Most appeared exactly as expected, but one dish immediately caught his attention. Somehow, mold had contaminated the bacterial culture. Under normal circumstances, such contamination would ruin an experiment. Many researchers would have thrown the dish away without a second thought. Yet Fleming noticed something unusual. Around the mold was a clear, empty zone where bacteria had failed to grow. Everywhere else, the bacteria thrived. Near the mold, they were dead. At first glance, it looked like a minor laboratory curiosity. But Fleming's scientific instincts told him that something extraordinary might be happening. He began investigating the mysterious mold more closely. The organism was eventually identified as belonging to the penicillium family. More importantly, It appeared to produce a substance capable of killing harmful bacteria. For the first time, scientists had stumbled upon a natural weapon powerful enough to attack infection without destroying the patient. The discovery would eventually become known as penicillin. What happened next changed the course of human history. Over the following years, researchers refined, tested, and mass-produced penicillin. During the Second World War, it dramatically reduced deaths from infected wounds and bacterial diseases. Conditions that had once been fatal suddenly became treatable. Soldiers survived injuries that would previously have killed them. Children recovered from infections that had once devastated families. Entire fields of medicine were transformed. Historians estimate that antibiotics, beginning with penicillin, have saved hundreds of millions of lives since their introduction. And yet one question continues to fascinate historians and scientists alike. What if Alexander Fleming had simply thrown that dish into the trash? What if he had been in a hurry? What if he had ignored the contamination and moved on with his day? History often feels inevitable when viewed from the future. But in reality, some of the greatest discoveries depend on moments so small they almost go unnoticed. Penicillin was not merely a triumph of science. It was a triumph of observation. Fleming saw what countless others might have overlooked. In a strange way, the discovery of penicillin echoed the story that began thousands of years earlier with moldy bread placed on ancient wounds. Those healers had seen results, but never understood the cause. Fleming finally revealed the hidden mechanism. The mystery that had puzzled humanity for centuries suddenly had an answer. The ancient war against infection had entered a new age. But as remarkable as penicillin was, it also revealed a deeper truth. Some of humanity's greatest medical breakthroughs were not planned. They were discovered by people curious enough to notice the unexpected. When Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, it seemed as though humanity had entered a new age. For the first time, diseases that had terrified entire generations could be defeated with a single medicine. Yet history teaches an important lesson. Every breakthrough eventually creates new questions. The discovery of antibiotics did not end humanity's struggle against disease. It simply opened the door to a much larger journey. As the 20th century progressed, scientists began confronting enemies far more complex than simple infections: cancer, genetic disorders, autoimmune diseases, conditions hidden deep within the machinery of the human body. Once again, humanity found itself searching for the next miracle. The scale of modern medicine would seem almost magical to the ancient healers who first experimented with plants thousands of years ago. Vaccines can train the immune system to recognize dangerous pathogens before infection ever occurs. Cancer treatments can target specific cellular mechanisms that drive tumor growth. Gene therapies are beginning to repair defects hidden within human DNA itself. In laboratories around the world, researchers are no longer simply treating symptoms. They are learning how to intervene at the molecular level, altering biological processes once thought untouchable. What began with a leaf, a root, and a piece of bark has evolved into one of the most sophisticated scientific enterprises in human history. Yet one of the greatest surprises is that modern medicine has never truly left nature behind. Despite all our technology, many of today's medicines still trace their origins to the natural world. Scientists continue searching forests, oceans, and ecosystems for new compounds that could become tomorrow's life-saving treatments. Deep within tropical rainforests, plants produce chemical defenses that may hold clues for future medicines. Beneath the surface of the oceans, marine organisms create unique molecules unlike anything found on land. Even fungi, the same broad group of organisms that gave humanity penicillin, remain a powerful source of medical discoveries. Nature is still one of the world's greatest laboratories. This realization has transformed how researchers think about drug discovery. Every rainforest may contain species that have never been studied. Every coral reef may hide organisms capable of producing entirely new medicines. Every fungus growing unnoticed on a forest floor may contain compounds with extraordinary potential. The challenge is no longer a lack of possibilities. The challenge is finding them before they disappear. As habitats are lost and ecosystems change, humanity may be losing future medicines before we even know they exist. Now, another powerful tool has entered the search: artificial intelligence. Modern AI systems can analyze enormous amounts of biological data, predict how molecules might behave, and help scientists identify promising drug candidates at speeds impossible just a few years ago. Tasks that once required decades of trial and error can now be accelerated dramatically. For the first time in history, machines are becoming partners in the search for new medicines. Yet even with all this technology, the goal remains the same as it was 50,000 years ago: to reduce suffering, extend life, and understand the mysteries of disease. And perhaps that is the most remarkable part of this story. Humanity's search for medicine never truly ended. It simply evolved. From ancient healers observing plants, to Egyptian physicians recording remedies, to Fleming noticing mold in a laboratory, every generation has inherited the same mission. Somewhere, right now, another discovery is waiting, another treatment, another breakthrough, another miracle. The question is not whether it exists. The question is who will find it first. After traveling through thousands of years of human struggle, discovery, failure, and insight, we arrive at a question that remains unresolved. Despite all the advances of modern science, despite the vast libraries of medical knowledge, despite laboratories that can analyze life at the molecular level, one mystery still lies beyond our reach. We will never know who first discovered medicine. We will never know which plant was first used to ease pain, or which moment marked the true beginning of healing. That story was never written. It existed long before writing itself. It is possible that the first medicine was discovered by accident: a hungry human chewing on a bitter root, a wounded child being soothed by a crushed leaf, a desperate caregiver trying anything nature could offer. Or perhaps it was something even simpler: a pattern noticed over time, a plant that seemed to help more often than others, a small observation repeated across generations until it became knowledge. Whatever the truth may be, it was never preserved. It belongs to a time before history, before records, before names could be remembered. But even though we cannot know the origin, we can understand something far more important. We can understand what drove it. At the center of this story is not a single discovery, but a universal human experience: suffering. Pain has always been one of the most powerful forces shaping human behavior. It demands attention. It forces action. It refuses silence. And alongside suffering, there was another force just as powerful: curiosity. The refusal to accept pain as meaningless. The instinct to ask why. The desire to try again, even after failure. At some point in time, these two forces met. A human being experienced pain and refused to accept it as fate. They searched, they observed, they experimented, and in doing so, they unknowingly began one of the most important journeys in history. That journey did not belong to one culture or one civilization. It belonged to all of humanity. It crossed continents. It survived disasters. It passed through generations who never knew they were part of something much larger than themselves. From that moment forward, something began to take shape. Early healers became keepers of knowledge. Ancient practitioners became the first pharmacists. Observers of nature became early scientists. And eventually, through centuries of accumulation, trial, and discovery, all of this fragmented knowledge evolved into what we now call modern medicine. A system capable of treating infections, performing surgery, managing chronic diseases, and extending human life in ways that would have seemed unimaginable to those first early observers. And yet, at its core, the story has never changed. It still begins the same way it always has. Someone suffers. Someone searches. Someone wonders if there is a better way. That simple pattern, repeated endlessly across time, is what connects the first unknown healer to the most advanced medical researcher alive today. We may never know the name of the first person who used a plant as medicine, but we do know this: they were human. They felt pain. They witnessed suffering, and they chose not to accept it. That single decision became the foundation of everything that followed. From healers to pharmacists, from doctors to scientists, from ancient remedies to modern pharmaceuticals, every step in this journey is part of the same answer. A question we cannot answer gave rise to a story we continue to write. And that story is still not over. If this journey through the origins of medicine sparked curiosity, there's a deeper world still waiting to be explored. Every story you just watched is only one fragment of a much larger human experiment, one that is still unfolding today. New discoveries are happening right now, in laboratories, in rainforests, and in places we haven't even imagined yet. If you want to continue this journey into hidden histories, forgotten science, and the moments that changed humanity forever, you can support the channel by subscribing. It helps this work grow and brings more stories like this to life. Leaving a like tells the algorithm this story matters, and sharing your thoughts in the comments helps shape the next episodes. What surprised you the most in this journey? Ancient remedies, accidental discoveries, or the birth of modern medicine? And for the next chapter, we'll go even deeper into another turning point in human history, one where science, danger, and discovery collide in ways that changed everything once again. Until then, take care of your health, value your curiosity, and never stop questioning how the world works. Wishing you a strong mind, a healthy body, and a peaceful life.